Hello, I'm Rosie Serdiville. I'm a local historian and somebody with a great interest in the history of the West End in particular. I'm going to talk to you about how the area we know as Scots Wood got its name. It dates back to the medieval period. The image that we have of medieval Newcastle is largely dictated by structures like the castle, built in the late 12th century and still extant today, although it's about half the size of the original building following the demolition that was necessary in the middle of the 19th century to put the railroad through there. When I first came to Newcastle, there was a display in the Discovery Museum. I've got a photograph of it in the corner there, which gave you a glimpse of what life was meant to be like in the castle in particular, and in the city itself, or the town as it was then. But the reality of life in medieval Newcastle, in particular in the area that we now know as Scotswood, was probably very different. It will have looked very much more like the houses that you can see in this photograph of a reconstructed village on the right. Even the castle itself will have looked almost rural to modern eyes. The area that grew up round it, based on the industry on the quayside, which was the main activity for Newcastle for many centuries, was slow to build, and it started out down on the riverside. The castle, on its rocky outcrop with its good view, was pretty well distanced from the town itself until much later. As houses expanded up the quayside and started to surround it, it became rather more crowded in the way that we would expect it to be today. Oddly enough, you can get a really good idea of what crowded medieval Newcastle would have looked like from photographs taken in the 19th century. These are some postcards and a photograph that at least one of them was based on, that are held in Newcastle City Library. And it shows the Black Gate, the area that was cut off by the railway line from the rest of the castle, and that became housing and shops for much of the city's poor during the latter half of the 19th century. You can see how the houses are jammed close together. There's not much space and nothing is really big. That door on the right there is minuscule. I love the fact that you've got the same woman appearing in both pictures. I like to speculate about who she might be and what she was doing. She was probably one of the people who sold second-hand clothes from the Black Gate during this time, living in the same shop that she carried out her business in, and probably with many other members of the family crammed in there. Even the bridge was different from what we think of today, and it sums up just how different medieval lifestyle was. This is a reconstruction that was made for the Great Exhibition in Newcastle in 1887. And it shows the bridge in its medieval glory, with houses, gatehouses, and even a church on top of it. This was the bridge that was swept away in the Great Flood of 1771 and replaced by a structure that was far more single purpose, really just intended for transport. That idea of a dwelling or a structure that had only one purpose was something that was quite unusual by medieval standards. The area that we now call Benwell and Scotswood was the property of two noble families. The people living there, mostly farmers, were tied to the land and were obligated to provide services and goods to the lords. Some of them will have been free-served tenants, but others were serfs or villeins. Their position was regulated by law, and their access to the land and to its resources was very limited. By the 13th century, the medieval manor of Benwell had been subdivided, originally into two parts, but then one of the halves was split again. People tended to refer to the three sections of Benwell Manor as thirds, but actually one of those thirds was much larger and wealthier than the other two. And this third belonged to the Scott family, wealthy and influential merchants who'd made their money down on Newcastle's quayside. They would become more and more important as the century rolled on. A number of them would hold the post of mayor, for example. And by 1296, they were the principal taxpayers in Benwell. You can tell how important they were. Merchants were generally not regarded as having the same social status as knights or other nobles. The fact that they'd been able to persuade the Kimball family, who held a share of the area from the Bolbec barony in return for knightly service, to split their holdings with them, suggests that they had a huge amount of influence, possibly political, but most likely financial. It's the Scots family that are the creators of a deer park in the area in 1367. Known as Scots Wood, it probably gave its name to the area. Richard Scott had to obtain a license to enclose the land, rather like the one that you can see here on the right. The Crown gave him permission to close off an area of 200 acres known as the West Wood, essentially the west part of Benwell Township. The park was bounded on its west side by Denton Burn, on the south by the Tyne, and on the southeast by a dyke. This is an image from a medieval manuscript over wealthy merchants. This was an era of dispute and some violence, and the court records give us a great deal of information about what was going on. If you've seen films like Robin Hood, then you will have picked up on that idea that peasants poaching deer on the land of the nobility were liable to be hung or to have their arms chopped off. The reality was more likely that people would find themselves in court, and those court records give us a huge amount of information about what was going on at the time, the disputes between people, and the way that the courts acted to protect property. We know, for example, from the records that even before the arrival of the deer park, the Scots were at odds with their neighbours. It wasn't unusual for enclosure to provoke quarrels, but Scott seems to have already been at odds long before 1367. We know that in 1353, prior to getting the licence to create the deer park, he complained that John Winchester and others had assaulted and maimed him in Benwell and felled and carried away his trees. And there are further quarrels to come. In 1375, Richard accuses his other neighbour, William Delaval, of breaking into the park in Benwell, cutting down trees, digging up coals, and driving away cattle to the value of £100, an enormous amount of money. They also carried off deer and took herons from their nests, carrying away corn and hay to the value of £40, and oppressing the tenants of his coal mines, John Delchamber and John Wickham, so that they dared not work the mines. They were also accused of insulting and wounding those tenants' servants, John Burndean and Roger of Willington. William Delaval said in his defence that the lessees of the mines had damaged his herbage by their work, and that in common compensation, John Delchamber had given him a pipe of wine, and John of Wickham 8 marks of their own free will. The rest, he claimed, was common of pasture and right of way, and that Richard Scott had actually breached his legal rights in enclosing the land. The jury, formed after many delays, awarded damages to Scots, including an amount for damage to the heronry of 13 shillings and 4pence, and found that Delaval had no right of way through the park because the licence had been granted by the Crown. A later Richard Scott would bring a similar action against Robert of Rainton and others for trying to break into the enclosure in 1387. The trouble did not go away. There'd been deer parks since Saxon times. After the Norman conquest in 1066, William the Conqueror seized the existing game preserves. They flourished and proliferated under the Normans, a forerunner of the deer parks that became popular amongst England's landed gentry. The Domesday Book of 1086 records 36 of them. Initially, the Norman kings retained the exclusive right to keep and hunt deer and established forest laws for that purpose. In due course, they would also allow members of the nobility and senior clergy to maintain them. At their peak, at the turn of the 14th century, deer parks may have covered around 2% of the land in England. The Scots family deer park followed an established pattern. It was bounded by a ditch and bank with a wooden log fence on top of the bank, sometimes with a stone or stick wall. There was a ditch on the inside. Some parks had deer leaps where there was an external ramp, and the inner ditch was constructed on a grander scale. That allowed deer to enter the park, but prevented them from leaving it. To establish the deer park, the royal licence was required, especially if the park was in or near a royal forest. Because of their cost and exclusivity, deer parks became major status symbols. Deer were almost all kept within these exclusive reserves, with the larger ones working as aristocratic playgrounds for hunting, often with the deer being driven into nets, which is what you can see going on in this lower illustration. There was no legitimate market for venison without an established provenance. You had to prove that if you were about to eat this piece of meat, you had got it legally. The ability to eat venison or to give it to others was also a status symbol, you see. Consequently, many deer parks were actually maintained simply to harvest the venison rather than as hunting parks. The small deer parks functioned as household larders and were attached to smaller manors. Owners would grant their friends or people they owed a favour to a signed warrant for a specified number of deer, usually only the one, and it would be specified whether or not you would get a buck or a doe. You'd present that receipt to the park keeper, who would then select and kill one and hand it over. You weren't allowed to just go in there and hunt it yourself. By 1472, the Scots Wood Deer Park, together with the associated farmland and manor holdings, had passed to a Roger Bertram, whose connection with the main line of the Scots is uncertain. We think that he probably married into the family. He left 4 daughters who were co-heiresses, and one of them, Elizabeth Cowdell of Carlisle, had a son who, after some contention, inherited a quarter of the fishery in the Tyne at Benwell and a quarter of the coal mines in the Eastfield and Westmore and a holding in the fields of Benwell. He became, in effect, the inheritor of the deer park. It's interesting that coal mining was such an important part of his activity in the area. It's a very familiar pattern of economic activity at the time. Cloth making had been a hugely important part of the North's economy ever since Saxon times. But as the medieval period wore on, coal became increasingly important. From the 13th century onwards, we see the Scots and their descendants extracting the mineral from their holdings. And the monks of Tynemouth, by the 14th century, as owners of the manors of Elsick, Benwell and Denton, were among the first to open out the coal that was so easily obtainable from them. The Tynemouth monks were already working coal in their own area, and shipping it down the Tyne was very easy. As the owners of salt pans near the mouth of the river, the monks had the expertise and established handling capacity and facilities to deal with it when it got there. Initially, the work was probably done as part of the service owed by the peasants to the landlords. As time went on, and especially following the labour shortages that came with the pandemics of the 14th century, like the Black Death, you found more and more people actually employed full-time at the job. The workings were probably open. Most likely they were small shafts of the sort known as bell pits, sunk down to the seam and then widened out until as much coal as possible was extracted without the collapse of the shaft. You can see an image of some people working one here. It's probably in Germany. It comes from a book produced by a German writer in 1556. So far as we know, there was no restriction on the method or extent of digging, and it probably was carried on without a great deal of regard for safety. We have, for example, in the record, the story of Richard of Ryton, who dug for coal in the field of Elsick, and the earth fell on him and crushed him. It's probably one of many similar accidents. Bell pits work by sinking a shaft down to the mineral, which is then excavated by the miners and brought to the surface by a winch or removed by means of a bucket, rather like a well. The bottom of the shaft is enlarged over time, and a sloping roof is created as the desired coal and any excess rock is removed, which is where it gets its name. It looks like a bell down at the bottom. Typically, no supports were used, and mining continued outwards until the cavity became too dangerous or collapsed, at which point another mine would be started, often close by. The type of mine had been in use since prehistoric times and would continue to be found in parts of the north right up to the 20th century. There are records of some in the area around Ford in Northumberland. In the bottom, you can see a picture of what looked like a series of holes in the ground. They're actually the remains of collapsed bell pits, in this case following the line of a lead seam, and it's from the area up near Nenthead. People often think that these are some sort of natural phenomenon, but they are in fact the remains of industrial activity. So what did Scots Wood look like? Benwell Hill is largely sandstone, and the material was probably used to create grindstones as well as providing building material for the houses of the wealthier and people of higher status. Most people would have lived in the sort of wattle and daub construction that you see on the left of the picture. It's a technique that uses mud mixed with manure to plaster around canes or withies that have been pushed into the ground. When it dries, it becomes quite hard and is reasonably waterproof, provided that you maintain it regularly by slapping on some more of the daub. The roof would have been thatch, either straw or possibly bracken. Larger buildings, like Benwell Towers, we know from a 17th century description. It was a plain oblong tower, 3 stories high with battlements around the roof. That sounds very much like other fortified dwellings created in the 14th and 15th century to defend against reiver raids. There's a surviving one in Corbridge, which is what's in the picture on the right there. We know that medieval Newcastle was concerned about the possibility of raids. There are many medieval city ordinances that forbid the recruitment of apprentices from Tynedale and Reidsdale. They wanted to keep the troublemakers out. This is a reconstruction from a living history museum in Wales that I visited a few years ago, a place called Cosmoston. And it gives you a pretty good picture of what medieval Scotswood would probably look like and what the interiors of most people's homes would have looked like. In Wales, the building material was cheap and easy to obtain, and so they used stone rather than the wattle and daub you would have found up here. A family living in the village would probably have spent most of their time farming. The better off might own a pig and an ox, maybe some hens. The animals would live in and around the village in the summer, but would be taken into the cottages during the winter. The family might also possess goods like a cooking pot, knife, ladle, bowls, mugs and spoons. and maybe, but only maybe, a couple of sets of clothes. They would rent their cottage with the land, paying for it by service on the landlord's land, and they wouldn't see coins very often. Food would be largely homegrown, with meat a luxury item. The staples would be the grains that grew well up here, oats and barley, plus vegetables and things like beans. Any meat available would be consumed. That's probably what happened to the herons that we heard about earlier. They weren't too fussy about what they ate. My friend Pat here is demonstrating medieval food at the castle back in the days when we weren't social distancing and people could actually come along and taste things. You can see that she's got some of the dense oatmeal bread that would have been common in this area. Wheat didn't grow particularly well in the north of England. And also some of the fruits and vegetables that would have been normal. I think those are probably green gages at the front, something that again grows pretty well up here. Food was very seasonal. The farming calendar illustrated here was based on the idea that you could only produce in season what you required. So for example, hens would only lay eggs and sheep and cattle would only produce milk during the spring and early summer when they were about to give birth. You had to find ways of preserving those foods for the rest of the year. By October, most of the animals would have been killed because it was so difficult to actually keep them properly fed over the winter. And the meat would be preserved by smoking, brining, or drying it. That was what you had to keep you through the winter. By the time you got to early spring, many of the stored supplies would be running out, and it would be necessary to forage for whatever wild crops were starting to come through. It's the time when people would be eating things like dandelions, nettles, some of the other edible weeds that grow wild naturally. And it's also the time when the port of Newcastle really came into its own, because by exchanging coal and the wool that was being produced in the area with ports like Nuneaton, you were getting grains coming into the area that would help to provide for people during that hungry gap. Processing the grain was hugely important. Bread and cereals were the staple foods and provided most of the calories as well as the nutrition for ordinary people. It was eaten in very large quantities. An average medieval farmer would probably get through 2 to 3 pounds of bread in a day. The mills to produce the flour were often owned by landowners who would charge for grinding. If you had a mill in your area owned by your landlord, you were not given the option of going anywhere else. You had to pay the fees to go there. Medieval mills were often post mills. In fact, that means literally a mill that's put up on a post and can be turned round. It pivots to catch the wind. It's a very clever idea. You find them in use throughout the entire medieval period and right into the 16th and 17th century in some parts of Europe. We know that there were also water mills around. In fact, there is an excavation up at Corbridge which discovered an Anglo-Saxon water mill some years ago. There is also, of course, the mill that everybody knows about that's commemorated in the name of Mill Hill and the Mill Lane estate. Sinton's Mill was probably out of use by about 1895, but we know that there'd been something on that site since the 17th century. It was constructed in 1638. It's speculative, of course, but sites often get reused. It's interesting to wonder whether there had been earlier medieval mills on that site, which were just rebuilt as the technology changed. If you didn't have access to a windmill, you had to fall back on the older technology of the hand quern. There's a picture here of one being used by another reenactor at the Welsh village I mentioned earlier. It's back-breaking work. if you've done it even for just a few minutes, you'll know how hard it is on arms and back. That experience of back-breaking labour is something that would have been very familiar to people living in this area throughout the medieval period and in the centuries that followed, as coal and factory work followed the process of industrialisation. It's an experience that people will have been familiar with right up to the 20th century, long after the factory workers and miners of Scotswood had forgotten just why their area was called that. Thank you very much.